Hello everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a tree. Now I was asked by a Patreon member to make this tutorial and I figured that for most of the time a tree like this where you can see the entire thing would be as part of a landscape or a wildlife scene where the tree is in the distance. Now the main biggest tip to start with that is we're not going to see all of the individual leaves. They are just going to be more clumped and clusters of leaves rather than individuals. So my biggest tip when we are working on trees like this of a similar scale is don't draw all of the individual leaves because we just can't see them in the reference photo. Now the only time that we would be having to draw the leaves is if we had maybe a squirrel for instance in the tree, but then again we're only going to see a portion of that tree. We might only see the branch that it's perched on and then some of the foliage around it. So that's going to require a completely different technique. But for this tutorial I wanted to show you how I would draw a tree if it was part of a drawing, as I say, maybe of a landscape. So I did this all in real time for my Patreon tutorial. The 1.5 hour version, as I say, all in real time is available over there now. So if you would like to see that, then the link is in the description below. But that's why my hand is moving where I'm explaining what I'm doing, the colours that I'm selecting. And here is the reference photo. I'm just basically pointing out that I don't like printing my reference photo because you don't get the colours or the contrast accurate, but I am just pinpointing where I'm focusing on my shadows and my highlights for this very first base layer. Now to start with, I'm mapping in where the main sets of shadows are first, and now I've picked a mid-green and I'm just putting in where the lighter cluster of leaves are. Now the drawing in the corner is a photograph of my finished tree and you'll see that I've got the sky and the greenery around it. I decided to add that in after because I thought that the blue that I'd put in where the sky is showing through the leaves here was looking a little bit out of place. I didn't like it even though this was just a study. I decided to go and add the sky and the grass in as well. And that's the biggest tip as well when we're working on a tree where you can see that sky showing through areas. You really want to make sure that you've got that sky in place before you start the tree itself. The reason being, obviously the sky is behind the tree, so we want to make it look like that in our drawing. We can, if we need to, go ahead and add some more of the sky if it's breaking through in more areas where we haven't put that in on our base layer. But for a whole, we then want to then go back and add some of the leaves over the top to again make sure that we've got that perspective correct, that that sky is behind that tree. Now for this I really do strip it back layer by layer, just like every tutorial. I want to make sure that I'm working on which is furthest away from the viewer and building up my layers from there. So with this I'm working from dark to light, and in the Patreon version I'm explaining that you like to have a minimum of 3 greens. In here I also used a yellow and a dark blue for some of my shadows, but you want to have at least 3 to start with. You want to go with a dark green, a mid-tone green, and then more of a vibrant green for your highlights. And I'd say that that would be the minimum, but you would obviously then want to go in with some darker colours, just like what I'm doing here, to start pinpointing more of those shadowed areas. Now when you're drawing a tree, it's really important to pay close attention to that light source. Now depending on where that light is coming from, it's going to then bounce on the branches within the tree, and then maybe you'll have bounced and reflected light on the other leaves and other branches next to it. So although you're going to sometimes have a main light source, you might then have other highlights and shadows which don't follow that light source because it's bounced light. And that's something that's really important to capture to make sure that you're getting that 3D and as much depth as you can within that tree. And although I don't have the space here to add all of the individual leaves because I don't want to be doing that again because of the perspective, I still want to make sure that I'm showing where the shadows and the highlights of those groups of leaves are. Now also something else to bear in mind when we are drawing trees like this is you want to make sure that some of those base layers are showing through. So I've got this really nice vibrant green at the moment, but I'm making sure that I'm not completely covering the darker layers underneath it. I want it to look like that all of these leaves that are closer to the viewer are still individual, but without having to draw all of those individual leaves as such. Again, going back to what I mentioned where we just won't see all of these leaves. If you imagine looking out your window and you've got a tree in the distance, you can't see all of those individual leaves, but you can tell where they are grouped together, maybe from the individual twigs and the branches. So that's what I want to be getting at for something like this. Also, something else that can be really easy to do when we are drawing trees, hedges, anything like that, is we have a tendency to make the trees too round and too smooth on the edges, where obviously it's in nature, so nothing is going to be uniform. We want to make sure that we've got that shape, those indentations of where some of the branches are longer and shorter than others. Just like with these lighter areas here where the leaves are clustered at the bottom, I haven't got too many here, but I have got 3 main sets on top of the shadow to indicate that there's a few branches closer to the viewer, but that are in front of the shadowed area behind it. All of this layering process, putting some of those lighter details over your dark areas, is all going to add to that depth within that tree. Now, this is quite a well-established tree, so it's got a lot of leaf cover on it. Therefore, we're going to have a lot of those shadows and a lot of those variations within that light and dark, so we want to make sure that we capture that as much as we can. So I went in with a light sky blue there to re-establish some of the sky showing through, and it just looked more out of place, and that's why at this stage I knew that I was going to go ahead and add the sky and the grass in after I'd finished the tree. Got it about 80% complete, and you'll see that at the end of this video here. And what I've done is I've darkened up some of the branches, and at the moment here they look far too dark, but what I'm going to be doing is overlapping more of these leaves over the branches themselves, because if you look at some trees, they're going to be all different, but some of the leaves are going to group and cluster over some of the main sets of branches, where obviously there's got a branch in front of it that is going to be overlapping. So we want to make sure that we are capturing all of that. Now you can see here that I have put some of those leaves over those darker branches towards the top of the tree, and it's now pushed those darker branches back. Now, something that I mentioned in the Patreon version is obviously if this tree is closer to the viewer, and let's say it had a deer stood next to it and it was that kind of scenery, this tree is going to be a lot closer to the viewer, and therefore you would see a lot more detail. You'd see more individual leaves, you'd see more of the twigs and more of the branches, the bark on the tree for instance as well. So all of these details are going to vary depending on where that tree is positioned within your portrait. But you want to go making sure that you've got that perspective. So if you've got a tree in the distance, the biggest thing to stress, and it really is important, is don't put too much detail if it's not needed. It's something that I am very guilty of. When I first started painting and drawing, I felt that more detail made my artwork better. But in some cases, on something like this, if you add detail on something that's in the distance, it just looks odd. It just does not look right. So if you can't see detail and you can't see the individual leaves, don't feel like you have to draw them, because usually it's then going to be forced. It will look fake. When drawing trees, they go through many ugly phases. So the very first few layers look terrible. Now, the one thing to remember is just trust the process. The additional layers that you're adding are building more depth. So each little cluster of leaves, each highlight reinforcing the shadows, pushing some of those areas back, will help to bring some of the lighter leafed areas closer to the viewer. So all of these additional layers are going to make such a difference. Something that I do often mention as well is throughout tutorials that you see online, scroll forward 10 minutes and back 10 minutes, and you can see just how much a difference those additional few minutes make to whatever it is that you are drawing. If you don't like it, usually it just means that it's not finished. When we're working with Pastelmat, because it's got that very unique, lovely surface for pastels, as long as you don't feel the tooth of the paper too soon, we can just carry on applying each layer and building more depth as we do so. So you'll see, although I say about 3 greens at least, I've also used 2 yellows here to make sure that I've got some of those lighter vibrancy colours coming through. I wanted to make sure that I really hyped up the saturation for this. And areas where I did reinforce some of the blue sky, I'm making sure that I put some of these leaves, not many, but some of these leaves overlap in those areas. The colours and the greens that you use within the tree are going to vary considerably depending on the light source, the setting of your artwork, whether or not it was taken more towards dusk and dawn. It is going to really vary. If identifying the specific colour is something that you do find quite challenging, because it can be difficult, an eyedropper tool can be of good use. An eyedropper tool allows you to actually select a part of that reference photo and it will show you that specific colour. So that can really be beneficial for finding out whether or not the colour you need is more on the warmer end or cooler end of the colour wheel. When I do my pet portraits or wildlife work, I always put the background in first, and here is a prime example of why. You can see that now my subject looks like a sticker. It's got that harsher edge that I spoke about earlier on. So what I'm going to have to do is now, once all this is softened and pushed into the paper, I'm going to have to go back in with my pastel pencils to then add some of these leaves that overlap the sky and the bottom section of the grass here. Now you can see here that as soon as I put that blue in, the blue that was shown in between the branches and the leaves looks perfect now. It doesn't look out of place at all, but that is because I've now got the surrounding area in. Now you might have a part of your portrait where you think it's just not right. You can't pinpoint what it is, but it just doesn't look right. Usually it's because you don't have the part next to that drawn in. So that's what I found with this. So if you do find that in your own work, wait until you've got the area next to it complete before you make too many changes, because it might just be that it's your brain that, it's been thrown off because you can't see more of your drawing compared to your reference photo. One thing that can happen when you've got the tree and it's joining up to the ground is that there is just a harsh line and no shadow. That will just make it look like it's randomly just placed there. It won't look like it's merged to that floor at all. So you want to make sure that you've got that shadow and you've got the angle of that shadow correct, because again, that will follow that light source. So once I was happy with the background, I'm now just going to start adding in the leaves that overlap the sky. You'll see that this now makes a huge difference, and it will now make the tree look like it's in front of the sky rather than behind it. If I didn't add these leaves in, it would look very flat and two-dimensional. It would look like you had the sky and the tree all on more of like a wallpaper on the wall. You don't want that within your landscape. You want to get that perspective that you have the horizon in the distance and then the trees or the foliage, whatever it might be, as it gets closer to the viewer, to be more in front. And like with any portrait, my very last layer is just refining my contrast, adding my brightest highlights and reinforcing my shadows if I need to. So I really hope this video was of use. As I say, if the 1.5 hour completely real-time version is of interest, I'll link that in the description below. If you've got any questions about Patreon, then don't hesitate to contact me. And here is a photograph of the finished drawing. And if this video was of use, I'd really appreciate it if you give it a like, because it does help. And if you want to get notified of future content and the videos that I upload, hit the subscribe and the bell button, and I'll be uploading another video next week.